Hey Daniel, how are you doing today?
Brian, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, been really looking forward to this conversation. Appreciate the time you're spending with us on the Pure Theory podcast. I wanted to kind of start with a question um, about your life. So, maybe in the first part of our conversation, we can kind of reflect a little bit on your history and talk about our shared histories. Um, so, I'm curious, what when you reflect back on your history, are there any early defining moments, memories that you have in relation to politics? So, like, what's an early defining memory in relation to politics that you have, and would you be willing to share with us?
Definitely the first Iraq War was the first time that I had like a true political memory or fear and apprehension because I saw the news and it immediately reminded me of like all the film and television I had seen about like war, which I was in fourth grade. And so that was definitely the first one. It was like this like jarring thing and anxiety and thought it might be like triggering to who knows, like a new Vietnam. That was my first political thing, and then I think that growing up in a kind of Oregon, uh, in Oregon, which outside of Portland,
Mm-hmm.
and in a I don't know if you're familiar with the West Coast
A little bit.
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that my kind of awareness of class or political issues in the immediacy of my life were actually absent,
Mm.
and that I didn't possess, therefore, any language or knowledge or sort of framework to see the struggles that were kind of around me amongst my friends, my peers, my family, until I actually read a lot more and left my home. So and then ultimately, when things really started to reflect with much more clarity is when I made a movement from kind of my, I don't know, let's say working class background into a professional arena where I live now in DC, Washington, DC area.
Okay.
That was definitely something that catalyzed or sort of triggered a whole cascade of like clarity as it
Mm.
pertains to the politics of my life. But global politics, it was Iraq War. I would say actually the two Iraq wars were, as well as 9/11, drew me into an interest in the Middle East, religion, conflict issues. That was the most mobilizing. The Palestinian
Mm.
crisis was also hugely mobilizing for me as a young person. So most of my
Sure.
politics were not exactly like rooted in the actual relations of my life, but were very much concerned. I mean, of course, the warfare is still actual relations, but they were very much concerned with imperialism, with U.S.'s role in the world, with I was reading Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and Edward Said as a young person, so I had that kind of I had a kind of liberal radicalism, but eventually I think my radicalism pivoted to a much more Marxist radicalism, which we can talk about the difference there. But
Okay.
but originally it was that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Just agreeing with you. Just
Yeah,
affirming what you're saying. Yeah.
for sure. So that, yeah. How about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for that, Daniel. Yeah, very strongly relating to what you're saying. Actually, our histories strangely mirror each other in a way, but I one a little younger. So my earliest defining memory is also being in fourth grade when 9/11 happens,
Yep.
and uh, reading an early Wikipedia article about Dick Cheney and just becoming enraged about
Yep.
like he's got a connection with Halliburton and
Yep.
being very
Yep.
caught up in like the interestingly enough, this is something I've been thinking about. Me and my friends in middle school and high school were very conspiratorial.
Mm.
Was a conspiracy theory was more an aesthetic of the left, at least for us, which has
Yep.
been just fascinating
Yep.
to reflect back on. And then yeah, similar to entering professional world and becoming more. aware of kind of class politics and how some of these radical liberal ideological tendencies myself were, given to me, not necessarily
Yeah.
thought through
Yeah,
in
that
very
actually
clear.
is the interesting thing is that Marxism is not a scholastic study of the objective laws of capitalism alone. It is that, but it's also a lived experience which is realized in ways which can be much more kind of real and palpable. And I think that that living Marxism is often not talked about too much. And one of the things that I'm obviously interested in is sort of what that might mean, actually, to shift our understanding of politics towards a different model than the kind of liberal radical model, because of various limitations of it. And as you know, having looked at my book, I don't know if you've gotten to that point yet, but I actually try to say that there's kind of a libidinal level uh, problem with liberal politics as well, which we could talk about that too. So I definitely think it's about facing up to the reality that most people that become politicized through a liberal framework, and they need to, and they often do, outgrow that. Sometimes people get politicized, obviously, through a more conservative framework, but for me, I was actually raised by extraordinarily conservative people around me.
Mm-hmm.
Divorced family, divorced multiple times, but every male figure in my life was an extraordinarily conservative figure, right? Some religious, some not religious, but overall a highly kind of strong libertarian, strong
Mm-hmm.
conservative orientation, and of course highly contradictory in their so-called conservatism, because they would definitely not be the kind of like traditional family values or sort of pro there was like a lot of wayward activity of their so-called conservative there was no consistency. And I think that ideologically, politically, that kind of defines American politics in a lot of ways, is like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of contradictions, a lot of incoherence,
Yes.
and I guess part of it is sort of how do we define what politics actually is for people as a real lived thing, not like something like some kind of mediated spectacle through Fox News and the elections, but like what is politics
Yeah.
in a lived way, in a rooted way, as like dealing with antagonisms that are practical to us, that are solvable by us, and that are also thinkable by us. That's what I'm more interested in as a form of thinking about politics. I'm not interested in accepting a kind of technocratic vision of politics, which is the only politics we're really allowed to accept,
Mm.
which is this kind of like mediatized, distant politics where like stuff happens on the screen and we can kind of have passionate feelings about it within these sort of narrowly prescribed ways to think about it, right? I'm much more interested in kind of upsetting that paradigm of thinking about politics. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very interesting, especially that last point. I mean, there's multiple threads that come up in your response there, from this transition, your transition and this kind of intervention you're making now with your work of recognizing a kind of radical liberal framework and kind of challenging that and inviting people into a more emancipatory framework. Then there's
Yeah.
also an interesting thread about, it's kind of drawn out by the men in your life growing up. This
Mm.
idea that comes out of
Mm.
your book that's really sticking with me about um, the no of the father, for lack of a
Right.
better word, and then also the father who helps you sublimate things.
Right.
It's kind of really interesting look you're doing at the figure
Yeah.
of a father,
Yeah.
kind of theoretically, not necessarily concrete
Right.
concrete
Right.
mind, but then and then this other things you're talking about there as well. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
that's
wondering.
it
Go
is
ahead.
interesting. No, so if you oh sorry, you got me excited to talk about that, but please, if you did you have a specific question regarding it?
Well, one more thread. I'll just throw out three
Sure,
associations, and
sure,
then we can go from there. Is
sure.
this idea you're talking about with? I like to think of it as electoral realism. This idea that the sites we battle on are electoral only, or mediated through the media, coming through the media,
Yeah,
Twitter, TV, etc. I mean, this
right.
strikes me in both of our histories. Baudrillard talks about the war in Iraq being the war didn't take place. This kind of mediated experience. So I wonder if there's something about our history too. Both becoming radicalized, kind of outside, like kind of
Mm-hmm.
watching on TV. Frankly, like
Mm-hmm.
becoming me through like Wikipedia, the internet, you through television and the internet.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot there that's really
yeah.
striking. So I'm curious what I
Yeah,
associate with those.
I think that's right. I think there is a sense in which the political, which we can define as a rare, uh, the political coming out of like certain lineages of philosophical political philosophy, such as the work of Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt, which are both obviously deeply problematic kind of
Mm,
right wing philosophers. However, even stretching back further, even to Machiavelli,
mm,
there is a sense, there's a kind of certain lineage of thinking about what politics is, as split between a kind of distinction between a kind of politics of class struggle in which the social order is in a condition of not only crisis, but is in a position of like potential transformation.
mm,
And Marx recognized this as well when he said that he didn't discover that class eternal, he didn't argue that class struggle is eternal, that it's like always present.
mm,
Rather, he observed that it's necessary to study history through what he calls historical materialism to parse out moments where you have class struggle and moments where the class struggle is muted
mm,
or even foreclosed. And so my argument is that one positive side of our generation, despite all of the challenges we have from debt imposed austerity to secular stagnation in the economy to all kinds of other challenges brought on by the era of kind of what called punitive disciplinary kind of
mm,
regulation on our everyday lives, the kind of collapse of middle class liberal ideals, the collapse of the efficacy of being able to speak about society with the same kind of John Locke glasses on. We can't speak that way anymore. That means that the political has reemerged. And so we're in a kind of different site of contestation. So I would say our era is marked by the return of something like class struggle. And of course, the language of class struggle is a difficult language for people in America to even know how to kind of enter into that fray. It's a challenge, right? So part of it is kind of literacy. Part of it's also like theory. Like Marx said that it's important actually for his own theory to be advanced based on the conditions of a given time, and it should be an active process. So what I'm trying to say is I think that Baudrillard, to go back to your point, and some of the ways we saw mediatized spectacle politics, even like the situationist analysis of Guy Debord, a lot of postmodern theory, they were quite pessimistic about political change, political transformation, you know. And of course, there's that big Francis Fukuyama idea that liberal capitalism after the Cold War entered into an end of history.
right.
So definitely, I disagree with this proposal. And you know, as you saw probably, if you haven't got there yet in the later part of my book, I'm really trying to say that psychoanalysis can help us think this shift from kind of ordinary technocratic politics that kind of works well on a liberal model into something where that has actually kind of broken down and there's more intense and conflicts. psychoanalysis through Freud's theory of the primal father and the killing of the primal father, which is not only some archaic event, but actually Freud meant is that groups repeat it, and that there's a kind of repetition overcoming that's necessary for a social order to overcome certain antagonisms, which is a crazy idea if you
Yeah.
think about it. So yeah.
Okay. So thanks, Daniel. I think we've kind of worked through some of our history and kind of what's going on in the present moment. And I meant to set up the book at the beginning. You've referenced it. It's psychoanalysis and the politics of the family, the crisis of initiation, which I have. I'll first of all just spend a couple minutes with my kind of blurb of the book. I have immensely enjoyed it, Daniel, and grateful that you sent it to me. I have read through it, but the book really demands, in my opinion, a close reading. And the source material is so rich that my kind of close reading, where I'm actually kind of following up on some of the sources, and I think really gesturing towards grasping your point, has only proceeded through the first few chapters. But I strongly recommend people check this book out. And I'm wondering, could you say, how did you come to write this text?
Mm.
And
Hmm.
how do you situate it in the history of Freudo-Marxism?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you bet. So I'm committed to the radical left, and I think that that's important to stress because the book is trying to build a bit of unity and solidarity amongst tendencies on the radical left that are divided with each other often. And you'll see in the conclusion of the book, I actually try to theorize that through the notion of superego. And there's kind of superego tendencies that emerge on the left today, and that have, even stretching back to the new left period, have then now are kind of, we're repeating. So there's a historical repetition that's going on. And part of the debate on the left revolves around, if we're committed to a revolution of capitalism, if we're committed to a transformation of the status quo, the locus of social reproduction is the family. And therefore, it's extremely central, mandatory, to imagine what a reconfigured family might be. Because again, I'm not working on the presupposition that the family is a divine transcendental entity which must be protected at all costs. But yet, nor am I fully committed to the proposition that the family as it exists now needs to be so thoroughly destroyed, right? As some family abolitionists might argue. For example, I was recently doing a program with family abolitionists, and they said, the very structure of what the bourgeois family has defined as the patriarchal father needs to be completely overcome and destroyed, right? I think that's not dialectical enough of a way of treating the problem of the family. So I wanted to write a book about what is the problem of the family and what is the core antagonisms that the family contributes to the social order, right? Like what is and so I arrive at some answers, and I try to kind of lay out a framework in a very theoretical way. I think I could write a part two to the book, which would be like application through like a pop culture, like more application. What I meant for this book to be is really like a theoretical guidebook for people to understand these kind of afflictions that face the family, which are often quiet, which are often muted, and which become kind of sites of even suffering that kind of go unacknowledged. Because again, for me, psychoanalysis is when applied at a social cultural level, not in the analytic clinical way, it is still an analysis in many ways of the way that unacknowledged suffering speaks through the unconscious, speaks, and how do you hear it, right? How do you so I try to then present an argument that the contemporary family is very much a class split family, and that we have a social order that is a punitive social order today, and it's best to understand that families are facing massive, massive punitive measures of poverty, of debt austerity, of basically absorbing much, if not all, of the kind of welfare state provisions that it formerly had. And that creates such a profound antagonism for which people don't have the kind of historical political language to understand how much antagonism that actually produces. So the family becomes the locus, or the kind of centrifugal point for all kinds of debates. This is what I call the cultural unconscious. Not in a Jungian sense, but just more simply in a sense of like, because the family is not permitted to expose its complicity with social reproductive labor, because from a Marxist standpoint, the family is a unit for the preservation of the capitalist system, but it is the one core unit for which, without its participation, it would be more catastrophic than a mass strike if every family performed a mutiny or broke apart, which is why in the Communist Manifesto, after the great uprisings of the working class in 1848 in Europe, the demand for the abolition of the bourgeois family was first heard. But note, it's the abolition of the bourgeois family. Is that abolition of the family as some abstract thing? You see, there's a difference there, which is what? Which is that part of the strain that families undergo is that there's only kind of one form of family that we can kind of inhabit and that we must imitate. And that's a classed thing, reality. And I feel that a lot of families fracture, divorce, struggle, and so on, because they are trying to maintain something close to the promise of what their family should be. And the stakes of that are extremely high. This is actually, if you study the sociological literature, the mantra of the happy family is a post-World War II invention. And it has, I would argue, remained a demand that's put on families. And so everyone can relate to the strain and the toil of what it means for the parents in particular, to have the weight of those demands on them. Added to which, in this country, the parents are responsible for providing the health services, paying for the college if they can. So it's an overwhelming, back-breaking labor, which we're not allowed to call labor. That's what being in a family is. There is a prohibition on making explicit the complicity that the family has in labor processes. The family molds our idea of labor, our idea of work. The family molds it. It still is molded off of, I would argue, a general Protestant subconscious of individual work ethics, even if that family is non-religious. That's still going to have that general cultural imprint, right? So the family is the ideological scaffolding of our social political realities, right? And so that was apparent to me after just like reading socialist feminists who study the family and reading Marxists who study the family, how important it is. How important it is to understand, And then the other reason I wrote the book is because the left does not have the tools to speak about the decline of patriarchy, and I wanted to find a way to sort of come at that from a new way, come at that from a new angle, right? Which includes the question of the father's authority in general, right? Which so far in like taking the book to different events and speaking on podcasts and having comradely exchanges with people about it, I've learned a lot already. You know what I'm saying? Like that's kind of been, I've had a lot of like post, after having written it, like kind of light bulbs go off for me about some of the things that I wanted to. Because, I start the book by saying this is just meant to start a conversation. And that's really what it is. It's very modest. It's just like, here's a framework. Let's talk about this with this lens in mind, right? With these perspectives in mind. That's kind of just the basic idea.
Thank you, Daniel. There's a few deep points there, especially this few things I want to draw out near the end of what you were saying about this kind of taboo on
Yes. Yeah.
recognizing the labor, and then also this idea of the decline of patriarchy. But
Yes.
first, I think just drawing out something you said right at the beginning, which I think is basic to your argument, but I still, but I still think it's not, it's hard to, it doesn't always land in discussions that I'm having with people on the left, my
Yeah.
comrades, people with me, is this idea of, okay, so when, let me try to speak very concretely, something like, and almost vulgar, in a vulgar sense, but something like the father function being, looking at this dialectically and not necessarily just like uh, completely rejecting it. So recognizing that it's important to have, limits and boundaries in life, and that can be very liberating
Mm-hmm.
creatively, and it can also be very suffocating
Mm-hmm.
and destructive. Where I think this point that looking at things dialectically, which I think has
Yeah.
been fundamental on the left,
Yeah.
in a lot of discourses I'm having, a lot of talks, it's very polarized almost, and it's almost like gender abolition or nothing, or
Mm-hmm.
any
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
recognition that to be crude, we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Any
Mm-hmm.
kind of recognition of that is automatically reactionary,
Mm-hmm.
automatically conservative. Like habitually, these reactions are coming up, and yeah, just kind of pausing there and just kind of recognize
Right.
and having these debates, I think are really
Right.
important. And so I'm curious, as you've been, because it seems like you've been having similar discussions. So like,
Uh-huh.
how has that been going? How is this landing in your discussions? Because honestly, like I typically am uh, just not having them. I'm interested in having them more. I was moved by your points and thought they were
Okay.
persuasive. But yeah.
Yeah. Understood. Okay, so you're definitely right that part of what the liberal ideological ferment that we exist in by virtue of being in these social dynamics of American life, I would argue, creates a sort of condition of kind of maximalist understanding of politics, right? By maximalist, I mean kind of like a theory of abolition which would not be dialectical, we could say, in the sense that it's actually, if you like to use my point about superego, is that one thing that maybe the contemporary left might benefit from studying within psychoanalytic theory, which is something I try to say, is the way in which maximalist revolts or revolts against a perceived power configuration. They actually then reproduce a new set of injunctions back onto that particular group that revolted. That's the dialectic of superego, which is a kind of insight that psychoanalysis gives to revolutionary activity. Put simply, this is what I call paradox of liberation, right? Which is like, yes, we make gestures to liberation, but there's a kind of excess which is never fully overcome. You could call this death drive, and that this is the kind of reason why you need a methodology like psychoanalysis to keep an ethics. You could call it modesty, you could call it humility, whatever you wish, around that point. So if you have a liberal or an ultra liberal maximalist vision of a kind of destructive approach to power, to racial issues to gender issues, etc. My argument has been we got to honor that because it comes from a righteous place and we need to have solidarity with that. And at the same time, also, I think put into discussion these kind of nuances, and paradoxes that emerge through maximalist demands. And now this kind of brings us back to history and to the New Left and to the what I call the revolution of everyday life. And the revolution of everyday life was emerged as a mantra of 20th century socialists, feminists, and radical left oriented politics. And one thing I don't talk about too much in the book about that form of thinking revolution is that it should be understood along class lines in the sense that, and I've written about this after my book, because sometimes you write a book and actually you're not, it could go on for a while because there's things you want to fill in. And one thing I want to fill in is that the counterculture left, which I have a great admiration for and want to dialogue with and so on, I studied its history and I continue to study its history. And in Marxist terms, often its demands come from what they call petit bourgeois class. Petit bourgeois class is a class which is exempt from wage labor, often. And therefore, in their exemption from wage labor, they formulate a different theory of revolution through personal experience. But Marx says this class is harmful to a broader revolutionary project because they cannot see themselves as classed, number one. Number two, they actually end up formulating a theory of experience that is not relatable to working class people. And this explains why I think there's a lot of discord and antagonism in public discourse today between radical leftists and kind of more, let's say, ordinary working class leftists, right? And that's a chasm that I wanted to heal, to repair, to connect. Because if we don't connect that chasm, I don't think the left really has a future. It's not an easy chasm to broach, but if you take a thinker like Lenin, that's actually what Lenin did. Lenin was a strategist, a class-conscious strategist, who would understand the way that different classes theorize revolt. And he would go in and he would critique the petit bourgeois class of what he called ultra-leftism, right? So that's kind of what I mean by ultra-liberalism, right? This kind of, and the way that ultra-liberalism tends to work out can be quite unfortunate because it can be a kind of, Joe Biden can support ultra-liberalism, right? A kind of anarcho-destructive anti-establishment spirit with zero attention to productive labor, to the kind of real of the basis of the capitalist social order, right? It's a kind of non-materialist, anarchist gesture, right? And then some Marxist and anarchist thinkers can also produce that. But what I argue from a psychoanalytic standpoint is that actually keeps us bound to Oedipus, which we haven't even talked about Oedipus yet, but maybe we should at some point. But I can stop there.
Okay, definitely want to get into
Yes.
Oedipus, but
Yes.
first, I find your analysis here of this healing the chasm
Yes.
very, very exciting and very insightful. And I think this concept, this idea, the revolution of everyday life that you draw out in your book, I want to ask you a methodological question now, because I think these insights, looking at a figure like Lenin, looking at the counterculture, applying that history, recognizing that history as it applies to our kind of present day, I see you as a historical thinker. You're historicizing your work
Yeah.
quite deeply. So what does that kind of, what was the methodologically,
Yeah.
what's the role of historicism
Hmm.
in your text?
Hmm.
How do you go about that? Why is that important? This question on, especially with a discipline like psychoanalysis, why do you historicize, and how
Yeah,
is this central to your work?
sure. Well, in the third chapter of the book on the social superego, I try my hand at a historicism of both Freud as well as a shift in the original Freudian theory of superego, which is brought about by certain causal dynamics of the capitalist mode of production itself. And that is primarily located in the way in which finance capitalism, because it disrupts what it does is it, in a sense, doesn't start a neo-feudalism. It actually brings us back more in line with the reflections that Marx himself had on what he calls post-industrial capitalism in the Grundrisse, which is basically a kind of experience that the working class undergoes greater and greater socialization, which is why Marx actually invented an idea that the working class undergoes a socialization of their own individualism, right? And that's actually a beautiful insight if you think about it, because a lot of thinkers have shown that when we talk about a theory of subjectivity, what it means to be singular, if you're coming at it from a Marxist point of view, what you have to recognize is that it's actually the proletariat that, through their struggle, produced a version of subjectivity that was a fuller expression, more socialized expression of individualism. That's why Marx called it the social individual. So the social individual, under conditions of post-industrial capitalism, emerges. What does that mean? It basically means that, in a way, the authority relations of the family become horizontalized and reliant on reproductive labor. They lose their original promise in the bourgeois family. And the core of the bourgeois family is a promise of exemption from wage labor. Now, that can take a patriarchal or an abusive form or not. There's many examples of a bourgeois family that were patriarchal. What does that mean? It means that the father decides who is exempt from wage labor and who's not. It's kind of up to his whim, right? He's the kind of sovereign decider. Well, for the working class family, the sovereign is not always the father, right? There's actually much more of a horizontalism, and the sovereign is the gig economy, is the demand to work at the wage labor job. The sovereign is exterior to the family. The sovereign's not interior, which is also why some of the demands of the ultra left can be coming from a bourgeois standpoint. Because if their demand is abolition of the father in an abstract sense, that's because their experience with one abusive father is then conflated to the universal, right? When in reality, working class families don't always or universally struggle with monstrous patriarchal fathers, in the simple sense that monstrous patriarchal fathers, if they're constantly at work, right, it's a different side of authority. You see my point? So that distinction between working class and middle class family relations and authority is really important to me. And it's really important to me also to, when we think about transforming the family, not to fall into this kind of particular universal conflation, right? Where traumatic and abusive personal experiences become conflated to all, right? Because in reality, the family, if you study the history of 19th century working class family, was the birth of subjectivity. In that, and we can define that in a second. But why? It's because the family was the site where value was realized beyond the value of the reproduction of the capitalist order. The family was the site which gave a kind of embrace to this subject, which they didn't experience in labor. And that experience created the basis of demands for a better life, right? So there's one family, it's called the bourgeois family. The working class is forced to inhabit it. They can't inhabit all of it, but with what little they can, some have argued historically, they kind of formulate a new demand. They want more, right? And then Marxist debate, is that demand for more of the bourgeois family? This goes back to family abolition debates. Is that demand going to lead us into a re-entrenched traditionalism and patriarchy if they want to strengthen the family, right? That's a big debate we're having right now in many ways, right? So that's a bit about the historicism. Now, specifically, I was really interested in answering the question, how do we think the decline of Oedipus in the context of post-industrial capitalism, that is, what changed both in family structure but also in social authority relations in this new era of capitalism where we have more punitive control, where society does not exist, as Margaret Thatcher says, it's post-welfare state. People are working more and more and more. There's all kinds of inequality. You know, what happens to the decentering of the patriarchal authority that was more present before? How is that restructured, right? So that was my main question, right? And then I kind of have an answer that we could talk about.
Yeah, I think that last point about the restructuring, it's very interesting. What's coming up for me is this as you're talking is this anecdote. I was recently talking with my grandma, and she was talking about like 1970, 1971. She started identifying as a feminist because of a very interesting anecdote. She went to the bank and they said, "Your husband needs to be here to get a credit card."
Oh.
And this is, of course, horrible, disgusting idea that very kind of belittling. But to her, it was kind of almost funny in a morbid way. It wasn't that the demeaning nature that kind of raised her consciousness. It was the fact that how poor my grandfather was with money and how good she had that role, because he was working in the steel mill, exhausted. She did, from Pittsburgh, working in the steel mill, exhausted, just come home, no energy to do anything else. And she kind of ran all. So that kind of the absurdity, like his kind of impotence to
Right.
do the money, was what actually turned her into a feminist, not the demeaning kind of lecturing aspect of like, oh, you need your husband here, which kind of jumped out to me on a personal level. That hadn't really crossed her mind. And this reminds me, in dialogue with your idea of the paradox of liberation, there's this idea I've been reading in Joe Freeman, a feminist, the tyranny of structurelessness. And
Yeah.
this idea that, saying that kind of men, for lack of a better term, like men aren't going to have this role, like just abolishing that or abolishing formal hierarchy, it does not, it in a sense represses the hierarchy. Like their hierarchies developed in these kind of, for Joe Freeman, in these kind of horizontal groups. And they're often like people had personality disorders, that wasn't her word, but like they seem to have like real like narcissism and be really destructive. Like they would take the power in the groups, and actually the liquidation of formal structures was very devastating for these groups that had for Joe Freeman, that had a lot of emancipatory potential. And she kind of does a defense of structure in this
Yeah.
book.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's reminding me of the paradox
Yeah.
of liberation is weird. And I think psychoanalysis has a good language for this. Like the father is repressed. It doesn't have to be a male working in a steel mill. That's not taking his power away to determine who's going to get the credit card. Doesn't abolish. Where I do think that is a good as a win, a liberal reform that I'll say great. I want that. It does not abolish hierarchy, and in some senses it can. Through the repression and the obscuring of hierarchy, take monstrous forms, which I see as part of your work.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I guess, for Freud, the father had a certain injunction of the social order actually at some point, and this is actually a very interesting sub-political context of Freud's writing and why many, let's call them libertine followers of Freud, could invert his theory. Because there's a lot that's been written about Freud, the father, and politics. In other words, does Freudian theory require a strong arm father at the site of political authority for the stabilization of the social order, right? And there's many positions on this issue. One that I am drawn to is that Freud invented the concept of superego in part to kind of come up with a missing theory of how to stabilize the social order, which we can talk about. Another idea that I'm drawn to here is actually that for Freud, the father, and this I think is very important, is actually a figure that must be transcended. So Oedipus, for subjectivity, is kind of a constitutive necessity. So what that means is that for those of us that want to really take on the deleterious and frankly violent consequences that come with a patriarchal family, let's say, we have to do that. We have to do that thoroughly, of course. But Freud's point is symbolically, every subject, and by the way, that father that symbolically you're trying to transcend, what are you trying to transcend? It's something about the originary dependence and the identifications, affects, which are often ambivalent, that emerge through this very strange, stunted self-development, which is biologically what makes humans unique, namely that we require, unlike other mammals, massive amounts of parental care for extremely long periods of time of our young lives, right? So Oedipus, in a general sense, is a kind of theory of a kind of working through those dependencies, right? And Freud says that Oedipus, as a dependence theory, let's call it, okay, is reproduced in institutions, right? So the society can take on an Oedipal flavor in what he calls artificial groups. And he was focusing there on the Christian church and the army. There's others as well, right? Like maybe we could even say college has that. And even you saw my reference to the new laws which emerge in neoliberalism called in loco parentis, which is crazy, crazy stuff. Because what those laws are about is a kind of feral parental Oedipal capture, even at the college level. And this goes into my core argument around how late capitalism, post-70s capitalism, actually has stunted our adulthood in some sense. So to repeat, the Oedipal theory is a kind of overcoming of these ambivalent identifications and attachments. The father is a function in the maintenance of pushing you through that, right? And Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, said that kind of takes two functions. You do have a kind of prohibitory father in the first Oedipal resolution, which is around the introduction in a more constitutive basis to the subjects to language. And I use the example of the Fort Da game of Freud to explain that. Okay, but over time, there's a second drama of Oedipus over this kind of freedom of, and I think intuitively, we don't need to necessarily relate it just to the psychoanalytic counseling room. This is actually where I take the liberty to use psychoanalytic theory and kind of invent my own way of thinking about it in cultural social terms. Because what I want to say is that if we re-envision the father function, let's call it, that can also mean basically that this takes many different forms. It's definitely not a biological father, but it's basically a function around the invention of a new desire. And if the era we live in is one that kind of keeps us dependent to ambivalent attachments, my claim is that we can diagnose our society, therefore, as a kind of strained Oedipal society, right? That doesn't mean that we need the patriarchal father to break us from that. No, it actually means the opposite. It means actually we need a new theory of mentorship, a new theory of solidarity, a new theory of inspiration, a new theory of sublimation, right? A new way of breaking from negative dependency binds, a new theory of recognition, right? Because if the liberal institutions kind of keep us in this feral, false, horizontal dependence, which I think they do, right? What does it mean to grow up and try to seek competitive recognition from those institutions? I think it actually means something different. I think it actually means we want to challenge that, right? We want to challenge actually what these institutions actually are helping us to facilitate, right? And that's actually goes back to the question of narcissism in the sense that if that's defective, if the institutions cannot facilitate that movement out of dependency, you get aggressivity. You get aggressivity, and you get uh, a defective dialectic between primary and secondary narcissism, right? And that defective dialectic is something that I think is very present and is very evident in the way that in the kind of bedrock of our sociality and of our social relations, right? Because, and again, I'm comfortable to say that that is tied into a very complex crisis of recognition. And I try to show that through an idea of Christopher Lasch, which is kind of interesting, although I have many problems with him. He says that basically this period of capitalism has created another defective breakdown between ideal ego and ego ideal identifications, right? Which for him is kind of like, it basically means no longer are we brought out of Oedipal dependence through the same figures that we were before. So like we lose community cohesion, we lose the power of like local sites of recognition to adequately satiate our dissatisfaction, right? Our dissatisfaction remains. And instead, we seek recognition from a kind of pernicious socialized superego, which is kind of headless, acephalic, kind of unclear, where it's, you know? And I think we've all experienced that. I'll give you a good example. Young people today are faced with the injunction to be popular without a clear notion of who the addressee is. It's kind of this kind of voided wish, right? That's a good example of what Lasch means by the social superego intervention, right? It's this kind of socialized mode of social recognition, which is creates a lot of turmoil for young people, right? And it actually takes a certain time and education to sort of learn to separate yourself from those injunctions. And as a father of two children, I just see it so much, you know, especially with the social media algorithms and the way that fame and individualism is defined, you know? There's no clear sight of the other by which we solve the impasse of our desire and the dissatisfaction of our condition, you know? And this to me is a big thing for me.
Thank you, Daniel. I think these points about Oedipus and superego, very interesting, especially towards a theory of maybe a new way of um, constituting things like inspiration,
Mm,
solidarity,
mm,
recognition. Very,
yeah,
very interesting.
yeah,
I'm struck. It's that need or demand or however you want to say it feels very real to me, like on an affective level. Like
yeah,
that really pings. I'm curious, like, and it brings me, I think, to the subtitle of your book, "The Crisis of
yeah.
Initiation."
Uh-huh.
Um, I'm recording this in 2022. I find it very, so I am a counselor, so I work in the clinic.
Uh-huh.
And so I just find back to Oedipus, after anti-Oedipus in the era, at least I'm in America, so in the era of, 9 or 10 CBT sessions, rapid, quick, insurance-friendly therapy,
Mm,
going back to kind of fundamental psychoanalytic theory, of course,
yeah,
historicized, feels very interesting to me. So my question is, the crisis of initiation that
yeah,
you describe in your book,
sure.
Oedipus, superego. How
Yeah,
do these things? How does psychoanalysis? What is the crisis of initiation, and
yeah.
how do these concepts?
I just wanted to lay things out very generally, and again, I wanted to discuss these primary kind of ultra central ideas of psychoanalytic theory in a way that would be applicable to our lives. Okay, so the crisis of initiation is a idea that I got from Jacques Lacan, and his notion here is pretty interesting, actually, which is that he diagnosed a kind of general civilizational decline in what you might call the efficacy of our belief. So if this field of this otherness is kind of unknown or kind of, like I said, headless, right? Lacan theorized that quite well. And I try to show that a lot of other thinkers did too, right? How do we, and I try to show that they're all theorizing something close to each other. They have different answers slightly. So the crisis of initiation is going to the heart of what this new configuration of superegoic power is, how it is affecting us. And I then try to show that one way to understand what a more socialized Oedipal theory is, not so much the constitutive Oedipus of the child, like accessing autonomy and stuff like that. No, my argument is that, and Lacanians speak about this a lot, is that Lacan develops this notion of the name of the father, which is an idea referring to how, for a subject to exit conditions of psychosis or fragmentation or even depression, and so on. Lacan argues that you need a movement of metaphor, and he's working with structural linguistics. We don't need to get into the whole details of that, but you need a kind of movement that would, let's say, in simple terms, break the subject from its dependence, as we were talking about before. That's my theory of Oedipus. Now, what I call that movement is initiation. Okay. Now, the word initiation has connotations to esotericism, to religion, and I'm aware of that, but I try to make it secular, right? Because I think that one way to understand a wide swath of experiences at the subjective level, from transgender experiences to experiences of people that are discarded from wage labor, like what they call lumpen proletariat or nomadic proletariat. What I wanted to ask is, what is initiation? There's a crisis of initiation in all subject registers, according to Lacan. And that has to do with something around the rise of what Lacan calls two discourses in his discourse theories. And the discourse is basically a structure that the subject manages their own discontent through. And it's a kind of And he would create these kind of diagrams to explain how they work. And he says that in our modern era of what he calls the university discourse combined with what he calls the discourse of the capitalist, both of these discourses share a common fact, which is that they fail to resolve the discontent of the subject's desire. They fail to do that. And in that sense, you have a kind of stunted subjectivity, a stunted desire often. It takes different forms, right? Different structures within the psychoanalytic clinic, which we could break down. But overall, there's a kind of a crisis by which people face the exit or movement from the Oedipal arena or capture. So in that sense, in a weird paradoxical way, we're kind of institutionally, socially, I think, more captured by that Oedipal drama than maybe we have been prior, even though the whole basis of the patriarchal family has undergone a mutation. My argument is that we still, the Oedipal structure, at least at the level of our relationship to the symbolic, what Lacan called the symbolic, and to desire in the field of the other, is still very much operative. And Lacan would affirm the same. He just gave it a different name. He called that process the name of the Father, which is basically a theory of overcoming those dependencies and inventing a new desire. It's in Lacan's thought, he has a very important idea of called jouissance. And jouissance is a kind of desire, it's a kind of enjoyment that is sort of sticky and hard to overcome, right? And psychoanalysis is a way of locating it and trying to transcend it, right? Like the actual psychoanalytic method of analyst to analysand. And one really cool way to think about jouissance is to connect it to what I was talking about before, which is the crisis also of recognition. Because when you have unrecognized enjoyment, right, you have a kind of concentration of jouissance. It becomes a kind of sticky barrier to overcoming. Because ultimately, desire needs to be freed up, right? Desire is the only basis by which we can actually have a kind of, homeostatic exchange. So the crisis of initiation is just a sort of framework to understand this discourse discontent, as well as you'll notice that I also kind of apply it to specific classes and to specific relations to the family, because the family is also an inductor of initiation, right? Yet there are some families for which people don't have access to that, right? And by induction into initiation, I think a good example of that is kind of like, the social capital that a middle class family gives you, you're initiated into. That can be quite difficult, which is like, okay, I'm expected to do well at school, to marry and have kids, and to get a great job. I'm initiated into a middle class thing. Well, I'm interested in what I call counter initiation, which is kind of an interesting idea because I actually got it from Rene Guénon and these right-wing guys who were accusing Marxists of going against kind of mainstream religious initiation. But basically, I was saying to myself, like, any change of the social order has to find solidarity with people that are like discarded from the initiation process of middle class subjectivity. And we need to make an inventory of that kind of subjectivity. So that's kind of one thing I kind of suggest. And again, that's something that could also be like, more further developed.
Yeah. Very, very rich response there on the crisis of initiation. I do commend drawing out this idea of counter initiation is absolute from Evola, from how do we say
Going on, yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting. I think hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to flesh that one out. I have a direct question about that one.
Yes.
But I did want to ask last night. Okay. Which direction to go? I guess we'll stay with Oedipal for a second,
Yeah.
because this brings us to a point of there's discussions around are we living in a regressed state, like from a psychoanalytic perspective, like
Mm.
pre-Oedipal, or is Oedipal an
Hmm.
achievement that we still need to make
Hmm.
uh, often, which seems convincing to me. And then there's other discussions in your book elsewhere is like Oedipal no longer relevant post Oedipal, like something about neoliberalism has completely displaced this.
Right.
I mean, can you help us understand this debate, your
Yeah.
perspective on it? What's your
Yeah.
kind of take? I think it's pre-Oedipal, right? If I'm remembering the book.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's first of all, I wish to draw attention and a warning to anyone that goes down the path of having this debate, because
Okay.
because it raises like it raises a lot of the heart of a lot of difficult emotional attachments. Because why? Because if we are pre-Oedipal, that means that we have regressed. We can't face a kind of overcoming of these dependencies from the institutions. What I argue is that if that's true, and the kind of field of liberal institutional life is kind of only going to reaffirm this kind of regressive, horizontal, strange, paternalistic dependence. And I try to show that the heart of liberalism is actually fine with that, even from thinkers like Emerson to Nietzsche. Nietzsche is actually a great liberal thinker in many ways, to John Rawls, right? That actually means something quite radical, which is you can be pro-Oedipal without being pro-transcendental paternalism. You see, that's the difference. The liberal social order is not only Oedipal. I argue that they create a system of thought, political thought, which actually prevents the Oedipal process from resolving itself. Because again, you can be post-Oedipal having kind of worked through it, or you can be pre-Oedipal having been not permitted to work through it. So in a way, I almost prefer to say we are pre-Oedipal and then we're in a kind of defective Oedipal dynamic. In that sense, people can kind of have a knowledge that we wish and desire to go beyond these dependencies, but a pessimism over the prospect that we can, right?
Yeah.
And also a challenge over the means by which to do so, right? And that's where revolutionary thinking comes up. And that's why I tried to end the book with a thinking for the left about alternatives to family, commune, what that might look like, paying attention to overcoming superego attachments in the left, cultures that we develop, things of that nature, right? So like I'm kind of at the end of the book trying to say kind of something close, not close, but reminds me, let's say, of a lot of thinking of kind of McIntyre, the
Mm-hmm,
Marxist
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
McIntyre, who argues that really the future is a kind of you have to subvert liberalism at a kind of communal cultural level and kind of reinvent things in a certain way. I'm kind of going in that direction a little bit,
Okay.
if that makes sense, you know?
It does.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm seeing a strong echo here, kind of circling back this last point about uh, the Oedipal. Um, like this formulation came to my mind, like the end of Oedipus, like
Hmm.
echoing the Fukuyama idea, like the liberal idea that we're at the end of history, where that we've transcended this thing, but
That's really good. That's really good.
in reality we haven't. And then connecting with another line of research we won't have time to discuss about your work, which is very fascinating, with the worldview Marxism and like Lukács.
Right.
Lukács talking about the pre-political, like, and you had mentioned that sometimes class struggle is not central to the age, and there's
Right.
projects that are more appropriate for that time.
Hmm.
And I'm kind of pinging with me this idea of wanting to bring these discourses together, these research lines together with Oedipus. I'm not sure how that will look, but I think it's interesting. There does seem to be maybe not an isomorphism, but a similar phenomenon of kind of repressing history, repressing Oedipus, and these are things that maybe we could look at.
I
Um,
agree. I
uh,
totally agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree because I think, as I said in the beginning of the book, Oedipus has a tricky way of kind of being an undead repetition that returns us. I mean, in a way, you could say maybe the post Oedipal figure is more Hamlet than Oedipus because Hamlet cannot resolve Oedipus, right? And Oedipus cannot resolve Oedipus either, in a certain sense. Right? They're both kind of stories of stunted initiation in a way, right? But I think the question is when we completely abandon the Oedipal theory, um, I'm not I'm not as convinced that well, I think that Lacan gives us probably the most radical hints at how to reinvent a mode of thinking about what a post-Oedipal arrangement might consist in, and and what those symptoms formations might be. And even a lot of the later Lacanian thinkers have developed some really interesting ideas about ordinary psychosis and borderline symptoms and stuff like that, which we could talk about, which kind of do refer to the way that symptom formations definitely do not fall along the classical Oedipal structure, right? And that's true. But my argument, again, was more at this refracted social cultural level, right? And I see there that honestly, depending on how you look at it, sometimes if the concept isn't broke, don't fix it. So it does make sense to think about it that way.
uh,
That I don't know if that helps. Yeah,
that helps. And
yeah,
we definitely have to try to recruit you to come on again to talk about this interesting thing about different symptom formation. But we
yeah.
have time for only a couple more questions. So I want
Sure.
to ask. I've been so in the book you use the Joaquin Phoenix Joker
Yeah.
as an example. So I want to take a quick turn to the cultural. Use a different Joaquin Phoenix movie because 2 days ago I was watching. I just finished rereading Inherent Vice by Pynchon
Uh huh.
and watched the movie. And I saw a lot of themes from your work. I mean, maybe it was just because I've been immersed in your work, but there are themes of ambivalence about counterculture, drug use, the pros and cons, the liberatory aspects, and the really negative impacts it has on the family. There's interplay between the hippies and the cops and the FBI, and there's this weird like Black Panther and Nazi combination that goes through this text. And I was just experiencing another thing I like about it is that in relationship to your work is it almost completely spans neoliberalism, the
Mm,
neoliberal age. It's set in 1970, but it's written in 2009.
mm,
So in the middle of the financial crisis, Pynchon is reflecting on 1970, which is
mm,
absolutely fascinating to me. So I'm curious, are
mm.
you familiar with this text?
I'm actually not familiar with it, but
Okay.
I mean, I think I definitely get the feeling for these contradictions, which are very important and very real, right? Because in a sense, if my thesis of the revolution of everyday life, because I kind of have this view, lately that I am of the mind that coming from a Marxist viewpoint, okay, that history is driven by like radical cries for egalitarian demands, liberatory demands, right? And that what that means also is that they're kind of truths which appear in the world and which also get steered in different directions. And this is what I call hypermarketization. And so, you can have a counterculture radical upsurge, the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, all kinds of kind of the personalist political feminism, etc., etc., kind of on a kind of spectrum of being co-opted by the market. And there's a whole theory there from the new spirit of capitalism, which is exactly kind of what happened. Now, some people that I've been talking with lately on my podcast program have said, look, the strength of a concept, let's say an emancipatory concept, is that it builds into itself a kind of wherewithal for not being captured by these kind of market logics. Like, I don't know, I create a theory of subjective liberation, which like Whole Foods cannot sell in 20 years, for example, right? And this has been an interesting question for me to consider, you know, as a kind of way of truly thinking about revolutionary ideas. Because, and I'm still torn on this, I'm still working this through. I find that the argument can also be quite dogmatic to say that, like, oh, we should only work with concepts which cannot be co-opted. I think that it's too narrow for me. And I find that the philosopher Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, who's one of the more kind of systematic philosophers of our time, actually gives us a deep framework for understanding how ideas do, in fact, get taken over by reactionary tendencies and by capitalism, right? And that was my whole thing with Deleuze and Guattari, which is that even Gilles Deleuze, the great French philosopher at the end of his life, he admitted that most everything they had done with Anti-Oedipus had kind of been taken over. And it's interesting that when he realized that in the early 90s, you know what he blamed? He blamed the logic of political liberalism. So it's not just capitalism, right? Capitalism is a kind of way of kind of mincing the value structure and the exchange structure of it. But liberalism does something else as well, which we need to be attentive to. So I can't speak to Inherent Vice other than to say that it probably reflects this movement from an authentic revolution of everyday life into its total marketized takeover, in some sense, and all of the absurdity that develops from that. Because in its original form, you can have a kind of utopian basis, which is not going to be taken up in an ironic way or kind of cynical. That's the whole thing with the crisis of initiation as well, is that Lacan said that it brings us into a social order in which we no longer, this is really important, I didn't mention before, we no longer are dupes of our own unconscious. For the first time in human history, Lacan says, in his theory of initiation, as a result of this defective initiation piece, we now no longer believe in the unconscious. So psychoanalysis is actually now changes its mission a little bit to pivot to actually now become a vehicle for people to reconnect to their unconscious. You see? Because in the prior historical conjecture, Freud's model of the unconscious, and it was a kind of initiate. It was based in a kind of the society had a belief in there, and that's a whole thing to break down. And Lacan, in his 22nd and 23rd seminars, Les Non-Dupes Errant, breaks this down. That's actually where I got the idea of initiation, from that seminar. It's a beautiful, beautiful seminar.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel, for that. It's really interesting. I cannot wait to listen back to your analysis of Inherent Vice, not having seen it, because it strikes me as a validation of some of the research you've been doing, because I think you and Pynchon are touching on something similar, Pynchon from the aesthetic kind of mode, more so than your theoretical mode, but a lot to watch, a lot to read. But if you do get a chance to check out the film, I think it is I'm not going to say more because I'm curious what your take, but especially the bit of the hyper marketization of the hippie movement. That is a
Right.
huge theme of the text.
Yeah.
Pynchon, and interestingly enough, this is something I've the ideology that typically interprets like Jameson and Pynchon's known as a great American postmodern author.
Right.
And reading Pynchon and Jameson has changed my perspective on postmodern. There's a sadness.
Right.
There's a sadness. It's not a celebration of the condition of loss of affect, loss of hope. It's a mourning,
Right.
which is quite striking.
Absolutely. Of
Anyways, I did want to ask. You've been very generous with your time today, Daniel, and I'm very grateful
course.
to discuss with you. If there's time for one final question, I wanted to
Yeah.
ask people watching this. We've been going for a little while now. Maybe intrigued by what you're saying. Where can they go next? Like, what are you working on? Where can we find your work?
Oh yeah.
What are some of your current projects?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, for folks that want to engage with some of the, I offer some seminars through study groups on psychoanalysis and politics, and it's a great service. It's a great YouTube channel as well. I post my interviews there. We do reading groups. We are hosting lectures, seminars, that kind of stuff. Pretty much free. We have a Patreon, but we put most of the stuff for free. And I got a partnership with Zero Books through that, so they let me post on their channel from time to time. I am writing a book right now on Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, and that's been a big preoccupation of mine because I believe that there's a new way to read him, which is kind of a fuller way to read him that we benefit from on the left, because that's commonly said that there's three major figures for modernity: Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. They're kind of like a trinity, you know. And at certain intervals in history, Nietzsche has become a central thinker to resolve and to give a perspective and worldview especially to the left. And there's actually a relationship between the decline of Marxism and the rise of Nietzscheanism. Yeah. So my book is an analysis of the balance sheet of that relationship and where it has gone and what the true meaning of Nietzscheanism is. So I'm relying on a bunch of historical research on the actual basis of the Nietzschean philosophy, what it really intends to do, and then what its function is when it's adopted by people. So that's one thing I'm doing with repeater books. And what else? I guess those are some main things. I do a bunch of other stuff, but those are some immediate things that come to mind.
Lovely. Awesome, Daniel. We'll definitely link those things where we're sharing this interview so people can find them. We'll really look forward to your book on Nietzsche. That sounds really exciting. And I'd just like to again say thanks, Daniel, and I hope you have a really good rest of your day.
Brian, this was fabulous. I'm so honored to have been invited, and it was just so refreshing to talk about all these ideas with you. Thank you so much.